Welcome back to the Messy Reformation. My name's Jason Rice, and I'm the Associate Pastor at Bethel CRC and Chaplain at Central Wisconsin Christian in Waupun, Wisconsin. My co-host is Willie Cronky. He's a member at Pease CRC in Pease, Minnesota. We're just a couple of guys who love the Christian Reformed Church and want to see Reformation happen in our denomination. But we realize that whenever Reformation happens in the history of the church, things get messy. And after the last couple of synods, and as we move into this rebuilding phase of the Reformation, things continue to be messy in the Christian Reformed Church. So we're taking the opportunity to have conversations with pastors and leaders throughout the Christian Reformed Church to find out what's going on in our denomination, but also to talk about what Reformation and rebuilding might look like. If you haven't already, take a moment to click subscribe so you don't miss any of our upcoming content. We're dropping episodes every single Sunday evening. It's also important for you to know that you are our marketing plan. We rely on you to spread the word about what we're doing at the Messy Reformation. We rely on you to share our content, and we also rely on you to give us 5-star reviews and provide good feedback for this podcast. You can also support us financially on Patreon or Substack. All the money raised is used to build the platform of the Messy Reformation. With all that said, we're going to get to this week's episode, which is part 1 of our conversation with Shelby Gemmen. So Shelby, why don't you kick us off and tell us a little bit about yourself and your family and the church that you're at?
Sure. So my name's Shelby Gemmen. I'm 37 years old. I'm the lead pastor at South Olive Christian Reformed Church, and been there almost 2 years. Before South Olive, I was a pastor at Grant Reformed Church in Grant, Michigan, and lent out there from the CRC. So I was there for 8 years, 4 months, and married to my wife, Stephanie, a little over 10 years. And we met on ChristianMingle.com. We got 2 kids. I have a daughter, Navy, who's 4, who's in preschool at South Olive Christian. And I have another daughter, Emery, who just turned 2 on Sunday. So, and then I should mention, my wife teaches like AP English and stuff like that in public school. So, God is good. We're happy. We're loving where we are in life. We're loving ministry and loving preaching the word and leading Bible studies. And I kind of grew up in the area around West Olive, which is close to Olive Township, probably about 10 minutes away. So I'm familiar with the school and the community. And so getting a call out there was really exciting for us to kind of come back closer to family, closer to grandparents for the kids and stuff. And so, we're pretty blessed, man. And we appreciate you having me too.
Yeah, it's awesome. Now, I don't remember. Did you grow up in the Christian Reformed Church?
Sort of yes and no. In terms of like where I was born and largely raised and baptized, I was at Seventh Reformed Church in Grand Rapids, Michigan. So that was one of the earliest churches in Grand Rapids, and it was RCA at the time. They left the RCA in, I think it was like 92 or 3 or 4, and they had kind of a reputation of high liturgy and highly intellectual preachers. If you look back, they had Gordon Gerard, who was on the radio in the 50s, and they had at one point way back, they had Martin Lloyd-Jones preach there, right? So it kind of has this, lofty Reformed theological tradition that, we were sort of a reputation for being catechized and having kind of a strict childhood. But at the same token, so my grandparents went there, and my mom had me out of wedlock, and she was there. So at the same token, there was a level of brokenness in my immediate family, but then I had a lot of support from aunts and uncles and grandparents in the church, and so it was a good upbringing. In terms of the CRC, my grandpa was an elder way back. He retired. My grandfather retired at 42, and obviously he was in his 60s by the time I came around, but he was kind of my father figure. And he was an elder at Rusk CRC, which is in technically, I think, Allendale, Michigan. So Out in Allendale, there's Gemmen's Meat Market, and kind of my family had planted roots there. His dad, my grandfather's dad, started a business, and then he retired at 42. His brother bought him out, and so I was raised by my grandparents, raised by my mom, and connection to CRC started with that Russ connection. Even though we were largely at Seventh, we just had a lot of deep roots with people in the West Michigan area. Largely my grandparents' siblings. We'd come home from church after PM service, and my grandma would always have her siblings over. They were in their mid 60s to 80s at the time, and they talk about the CRC Synod, and they were kind of like the old school Dutch, right? And so that was kind of my initial connection to CRC, and so that planted on very, very early in me the ideal of when I became a minister later, just like, where would I go? Right, Calvin Seminary was the top of my list, despite a lot of the unknowns I had about it. It was geographically close, right? So I would kind of, through osmosis, ended up in the CRC that way eventually.
Yeah. Well, why don't you tell us about your call to ministry? What did that look like? Is it something you always kind of knew you were going to do, or?
Yeah, no, that's an awesome question. Yeah, I think I kind of had an ideal of it in the back of my mind, but to be honest, I didn't really tell anybody, and I didn't talk about it. I can remember my mom kind of saying things like, the greatest thing the highest calling you can do is be a pastor, right? And that was, for me, something that I thought about, and something that stuck with me. And she wasn't anyway pushing me towards that avenue. She just was naming that, right? And I remember that, like, really honoring the office and really respecting elders and church leadership and caring about the business of the church. In terms of calling, I was baptized at age 4, raised in the church, catechized. So I was fairly well discipled, went to the Christian schools and stuff, and started to actually go down an IT route. So, I got advanced standing in college placement, and I could have gotten a bachelor's in like 2 years in a program. My first year, my GPA wasn't bad in high school, but I was turning my GPA around. And I was really at that point like, okay, I'm either going to go to, Kuiper College or Reformed Bible College and go all in and just learn theology and Greek and just, who knows, teach, or I didn't know, be a pastor. I really thought more a teacher. But then at the same time, I was in this IT background, and I was looking at like MIT, and I was like, okay, this is awesome. I could potentially get in, and there's full rides with that, right? Which is kind of the Ivy League School of Technology. So I was doing really well in that area. But to be honest with you, after I took some classes in IT, I had 2 things going on. One is I was just bored to death. I did not want to just be like a coder in some office for 50 years. And I know you can glorify God on that. Praise God for people who do that for a living. That just was not my thing, not where I wanted to be. And then I heard a sermon, and during this season, within the past 3 years, I had gone through all kinds of hard stuff, from bullying in high school and conflict in family systems, and things of abuse and self-reflection, and reading the Bible from cover to cover probably 11 times before I graduated high school. Audiobook and hardcover, and just loving at church. Like, for whatever reason, I just loved Bible study, college and career group, like just learning the word and it just soaking it all in. And so I did kind of gen eds at Davenport, and I was ready for both paths as I was kind of praying and discerning. And this sermon just struck me. I mean, I'd heard the passage before. It was from Ephesians 2, right? For by grace you've been saved through faith, and it's not your own, it's the gift of God. Lest anyone should boast, right? And verse 5 and 8 say about the same thing in chapter 2. But I just had this, like, I don't know. I was already a converted Christian, but I had this sort of like spiritual revival, right? This one of my pastors, I remember saying, Jonathan Edwards talks about this, that there's almost like you're already born again, you're already a believer, but you have this like awakening, and this ideal I had of Jesus was so distant at the time before this sermon, right? This ideal I had of Jesus was like, honor God every day, glorify him. He'll sanctify you. But there wasn't this real sense that I had an awareness that he was in me and loved me and affected me. And so the gospel kind of awakened me in a way that I had known in an intellectual sense, but not like in an emotional, spiritual, connecting the heart and the mind and all these things. And that all the more, along with searching out and pushing back against all my insecurities, right? I mean, who am I to be a preacher? I don't know how to public speak. I'm kind of an introvert by nature and all these things. And you read about these people in the Bible, right? And they all are full of insecurities and failures, from Moses to Paul to every single one of them. You can look at the prophets. And it's like, these are the people that God uses, right? And so sorting that theology out gave me just this immense sense of peace to just say, you know what, that's the point, is to trust God. I don't know what's going to happen. I could go to Bible college and not end up being a pastor, but that's the thing, right? That you pursue this internal call and you say, Lord, make that external call clear. So that was the big thing. And there's a lot of history there, so I'll let you guide me with follow-up questions, because I did volunteer youth ministry. I did 5 internships and then became a pastor after that one. But yeah.
It's interesting. There's a lot of people that I run into that talk about that kind of, I don't know, that awakening. I think that's probably the best thing. That I had the same thing where I didn't grow up in a Christian home, and I gave my life to Christ when I was about 10. But it was kind of there, but it wasn't real for a while. Like I can look back now and see all of those moments where God was like trying to like pull me back, and pull me in. And I was kind of like ignoring him, but it was in my early 20s when all of a sudden I had this awakening, and all of a sudden there was just new life, new love, new hunger for the word, all of that. Yeah. And I've talked to a number of people who are like, well, that was my conversion. And I'm like, I don't know if I wouldn't say that was my conversion. There was an awakening,
And I get that, and I say amen to that. I mean, I had times where I cried in the middle of the night in 4th grade. I was 10 after Borco Christian School's Bible class, right? Or my baptism at age 4. I can remember the water running down and feeling the Holy Spirit wash over me in a sense. And so there are times where, I think that there's a distinction. I think we're born again. Maybe at one point we have this sort of spiritual awakening. At least that's how the Puritans distinguished it, right? If you want to debate that, but that's what I was heard and told. So
yeah, I always even push back. Maybe this is controversial. Maybe I'll get yelled at for this, but there's this point in John Calvin's commentary on the Psalms where he talks about this awakening, and people often go to that and say, "Oh, this is John Calvin talking about his conversion." And I'm like, actually, when I read that, it's almost an exact description of what you just described about your awakening and kind of called to ministry, my awakening and called to ministry, and a bunch of other pastors. And I'm like, I don't think he's describing his conversion in that. I think it's this kind of awakening where God makes it very real to you.
Yeah. I think, and you see this in seminary and in Bible college, right? Like there's everybody kind of comes in. Well, a lot of people, I won't say everybody, but a lot of people come in with a pretty strong sense of like, I'm called, right? I'm going to do this. Mm-hmm. And I remember someone saying that in a class, and they were just gone in 6 months, right? Like they just dropped out of the face of the earth. But I think what a true internal call does is it becomes this like unstoppable force, right? And you start to become more and more public, and then the external call comes, and then even then, who knows, right? Ministry is for many seasons at times. But I pray for me that it's lifelong, right? And for you and others as well. But it's hard, right? There's a lot of suffering, and it affects the body. Mm-hmm. And there's always the opportunity, and people around us are more than willing to agree. Well, I mean, you can always throw in the towel, because we have all kinds of failures and insecurities, and people constantly point them out in ministry. But if you persevere, you can do so much good for the kingdom, right? And so that pursuing that love for Christ for me. And again, there's the quote, I think it's Jonathan Edwards again, that if you can do anything else, do anything else. And he's not saying that cynically. He's saying that if you don't have this unstoppable force inside of you, compelling you, desiring you to love Christ in such a way that you would just be itching to get out of this job to go preach, right? And that's what it is for me. I was going to say that's what it was for me, but that's what it is for me. Is like there are days where it's like, humanly speaking, like ministry's hard, but I would always be preaching the word in some capacity, right? Like even if my church let me go or closed or something, I would be, I don't know, in the shelters. It's just kind of like we can't not proclaim the glory of the risen Christ, right? And I just think that's, to me, it's just such a joy to see how it changes people. And
Yeah. Yeah. I always say I relate. Maybe this is out of context, but Jeremiah has that moment where he said, I tried to keep quiet, but it was like a fire welling up in my bones. Like he's
Yeah,
just like, I
yeah,
just couldn't. I just couldn't.
yeah,
And I think that's a pretty clear, a
yeah.
clear indication of a call where God is just putting something in you and you have to speak. You can't be quiet about it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so you mentioned early on that Calvin Seminary was kind of at the top of your list. What made it the top of your list for a seminary?
Yeah. Well, my earliest memory of it, which later changed and became more realistic, but my earliest memory is like my mom and I would go occasionally away on the weekends, groceries or whatever, and we'd go down Beltline, and the seminary was there, and I was like, what's that, right? What's that building? And she's like, oh, that's where men of God go, right, to be ministers. And so that was probably like age 6 or 7. So there was kind of that ideal. And then as I got older, I had lots of aunts and uncles. My grandparents had 6 kids, right, and they all had spouses. And so, like I said, there were always these Sunday night conversations. There were sleepovers at my cousins' houses, and there was a lot of talk about problems in the CRC. I mean, so I had aunts and uncles in every flavor of the Reformed faith, right? URC and OPC and PCA NAPARC and other CRCs, RCs. So I heard about all the controversies and knew them well before I was probably 18, even, right? And so there was a sense where I had a certain arm's length or suspicion of Calvin Seminary, but I also looked at the roster, and as kind of an intellectual, I'm able to like really admire people that were there at the time. I know a lot are retired now, but in my era,
Mm-hmm.
Richard Muller and John Bolt, who translated Bavinck, and I mean, just a good core intellectual faculty that even some of the other traditions that were saying, yeah, these are good, reputable scholars, and you can learn there, right? And so even though there was that kind of that inner turmoil, that ultimately, and just between the practical situation, right, geographically being closer, and not, I did look at Westminster, Philadelphia, and other places, but just that sense of like being there alone, not as much support, financial and otherwise, it just made sense. So that's ultimately where I cast my lot.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that was me too. That was a big part of why I ended up going there. Sadly, I ended up going distance. And then when I started is when all those guys were retiring. I think
Oh yeah,
Bolt and Muller and all those guys retired my first year there. So I never got to have any of
yeah,
them. So I was a little bummed, but
yeah, yeah. And I remember you, right? You went to the EPMC, and I remember you, and I was a TA for Professor Bosma, and I went through the Logos course and did well, and kind of caught his eye because I was pretty quick with computers from my background. And when the previous TA, Phil Wester, I believe it was, he graduated, then Professor Bosma took me on, and what a pleasure to see students like yourselves and many others, and get to see I got to grade a lot of the tests and quizzes, so it helped my edge with Hebrew, Greek, and all these other things. And so those were good years. Like I said, there's always controversy in the air in churches and denominations, but overall, just good devotional years. I felt close to Christ, reading Bavinck and getting to know the people, and so I have good memories.
yeah. Yeah, me too. And I know some people hear me talk, not a lot, but I talk fairly regularly about some of the frustrations I had at Calvin Seminary. But
Sure.
I've said it's a mix. I have some really, really good memories with some good
Yeah.
professors and some good classes, and then other memories that, stick with me for for
Oh
more
yeah.
negative reasons as well.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the
Yeah.
things, while you're thinking of the next question, one of the things that stands out to me is, my family, almost all my uncles had concrete business. So I would do a lot of concrete. And then I had some other jobs like carpentry. And, you meet some people that are really rough around the edges. And then, you know, the stressful days, people cursing, throwing tools, whatever, walking off the job angry because of drama. And then you go to Bible college or you go to these seminaries. It's like everybody is so nice, right? Like everybody is so nice, and even though I knew a lot of godly Christians at church, it was just like, man, how blessed are we to be able to just learn the Word of God for a living, and to take that joy and character into a broken world where people see us be a light, right? So anyway, that just is I will just never forget my first few months, kind of almost healing actually from just a lot of the the experiences there. Not that you can't be a God-fearing Christian in those veins too, but it's very challenging to be in some of those environments in the trades. So
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I worked in a lot of those. I worked for a cabinet shop. I was a framing carpenter for a while. Worked for a vet clinic.
yeah,
I've been worked with a bunch of concrete guys are just rough.
they are. Yeah, but good memories though too. But yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So what was your experience at Calvin?
Well, what just in sort of general, like what my path?
Yeah, what was your general kind of feel at the seminary?
Yeah. So I graduated college from Kuiper in 2010 in December. I took, like I said, I was kind of on track to graduate with a more technological bachelor's in like 2 years. And so I was like taking summer school and I was all ready. And then, so a double major pre-7 degree took me like 3.5 instead of, a shorter term. So I graduated a semester early and I figured that was good, kind of take a few classes, get my feet wet. I was working part-time at Baker Bookhouse in Grand Rapids, and just kind of trying to make my way, pay rent and give plasma and all that. And, at first, it started out kind of slow, kind of light. There's some spiritual formation classes. I do remember Hebrew being very challenging. I'm not at all a Semitic language expert. I'm more of a Greek guy and systematics guy. So early on, it was like, okay, some of these classes, I felt were kind of light, but I was like, it's not unfamiliar. There was some of that in Bible college, and a lot came in without Bible college classes. So I think that it was a nice relief. And even though part of me kind of, was like, I wish they're a little harder, but the other classes more than made up for it, right? Some of the Hebrew and some of the challenges and just my busy work schedule, right? So I was grateful for that. What I did along the way eventually, when I anticipated more of those, the lighter classes coming, is I got admitted to Puritan Seminary and I transferred about a third of my degree in. And then I could really scratch that itch, right? I took a class with Joel Beakey and all these rich theological systematic classes. And so I felt like I was really supported in that way with orthodoxy. Well, going through Calvin Seminary and seeing what was taught, it was challenging. It was intellectual. The outside critique of Calvin Seminary that I learned much later, probably a decade later, was that it's highly rational, right? But a lot of seminaries that are solidly reformed are very biblically principled, very confessional. And so it's kind of a melting pot, right? I mean, even now, it's hard to even speak to what it is now, because when all these professors roll over, it becomes a different thing. But at the time, there was pretty good stuff. I mentioned Bolt and Muller, and there you had the opportunity to go really hard, orthodox, intellectual, historical, or you could take a more practical route, and I can't even speak to that because I wasn't in a lot of those. I just, like I said, some of the early classes turned me off, but the rest of it was fantastic in terms of when I really dug in and learned how to write at a scholarly level and get peer-reviewed publications, and like I said, became an editor and a TA. And so for me, it was positive. In hindsight, upon graduation, I remember when I was getting examined by my classes, which was Classes Georgetown at the time, which was somewhat of a moderate classes, right? They kind of said immediately, yeah, like the whole 4-page thing and the preaching style, just that's not what we're gonna do. Just do kind of a 3-point sermon. And so I had some pretty interesting texts. I always like to do something I've never done before. So I didn't preach something simple. I think I preached like Ezekiel like 19 or whatever it is, where it's like Satan is the fall of Satan compared to the Prince of Tyre. I mean, so I did some pretty weighty, interesting things. And yeah, it just was good. But, I think I just want to name that. I think the seminary gets a lot of scrutiny from the outside, but it still has its rigors. I mean, oral comps was no joke, and there's some real things there that are challenging. But yeah, overall, I think that with a lot of the things that went on with the denomination, and there's some good people that retired. There's some people that left, that in terms of biblical orthodoxy, confessionalism, biblical marriage, right? There's clarity there, at least on paper now, and they made some good hires. So yeah, I mean, I have an optimistic spirit about it. I know it's always been a mixed bag and probably will be. If you look at you look at these eras, they once fired all the faculty in the 50s, and it did because of the love controversy. And So there's always been controversy, right? The common grace controversy in the 20s, and so I guess being somewhat historically literate, I have a certain degree of empathy for just human error, and it's always true. There. So
yeah, and I remember some of the best advice I got for college and seminary wasn't like personally from John Piper, but I just remember him saying it in a talk somewhere where he said, when you're at college and when you're at seminary, don't pick classes, pick professors.
Yeah.
And he said, if you find a good professor that really knows their stuff and you can really learn from, take every class you can possibly with that professor. Sure. And so I did that. And as much as I could. Now, distance, I didn't have as much flexibility, but to the best of my ability, I took every one of my like individual work study classes or independent studies and took those with the professors that I really appreciated. And so that helped. That helped a lot. Right. You can kind of move toward the professors that are good and stay away from the professors that are not as great, and still have a really good experience there. Yeah. So I'd be curious. So you had said, now correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I heard you right. You served in RCA church, right?
Yeah, correct. Yeah, Grant Reformed Church. And so the CRC Synod in 2014, they made basically a category where you could be on loan for your first 2 years at sort of a probationary period. Because it used to be you needed something like 2 to 4 years in a CRC before you could serve RCA. Well, now they made a sort of provision where you could do it, but you had to have your CRC elders sort of assess you and give you a review, which they did, and everything went well. And so, yeah, so those, so I ended up being there, like I said, 8 years, 4 months. And for my wife and I, it was longer than we expected. If you would have asked my wife, she, is not a country person at all, right? She wanted to teach in the inner city. In fact, when we interviewed, I was kind of like, well, what do you think? How do you like it? We had 4 or 5 churches, but they were all over the country. This one was closest to family, and she had tears down her eyes just because she's like, there's just corn everywhere, and I'm like, well, but I tell you, so I get the call and I say, look, I 100% am not going to sign this unless you are 100% in with me that we're going to love these people and we're going to bring Christ, right? And she did, and it was great. Mm-hmm. And within 2 weeks of being there, she gets a job at the public high school and teaching English. So God blessed us richly. But yeah, so sorry to stay on point to your question. We were in the RCA. The RCA was obviously going through a lot of hard times, right? I got to classes in Northern Michigan. I think there were about 26 churches or something like that. And they knew I was very, and I'm pretty clear cut guy, right? I'm pretty outspoken on my views. I might not always name them publicly in public settings, but it's pretty clear cut. I believed in biblical marriage, and I had a firm grounding and so on. And so I ended up being vice president, and there's sort of an emeritus role where you kind of help the incoming president. And so the year that I was president, there was a lot of like this desire to dialogue, right? Which to me oftentimes is sort of a subtle way to shroud dishonesty and hide our presuppositions and our views and say, well, basically, let's keep talking to see how we accept each other until our more liberal views on marriage and LGBTQ plus and all these things are permitted in. And I kind of just named that. And I was like, this is what's really going on here, right? And if you have these discussions, this is what's going to open the door for division. And not only that, but we already had at the time in the RCA very clear biblical positions that basically just pointed to the catechism, and still does, by the way. So there's always been that sense of orthodoxy on paper or unorthopraxy in reality, right? Much more so than the CRC in many denominations because of the ignorance of church order, the lack of care, all these other things that went into that. So the year after me, a new president came in, and it wasn't anything to do with him, by the way, but it was just the flow at which the whole thing was happening. That they sent us to a conference, me and the next incoming president in Colorado, and unknown to me at the time, I knew the RCA was going through discussions of division, but they had a team kind of talking about how to make gracious separation, right? Because they were gridlocked. and they were talking like 6 different denominations, maybe more. And I know that's about where they landed. It was about 6. The biggest one was the Alliance of Reformed Churches in terms of the more biblical Orthodox, and they by osmosis had about maybe 60% of the church's land. And to give you a sense, I mean, within like 3 years' time, the classes I was a part of and president of, I think they lost like, I don't know, 80% of their churches. I mean, it was a real transition for a denomination that's 200 plus years old. Their church order is older than the U.S. Constitution. I mean, that is a big deal, And so the Alliance said, hey, we're going to be a landing pad. And basically what that meant is you could stay and try to help form a denomination. They still exist. Or you could stay for 5 years and kind of meet these church order requirements and all these things in the RCA, right? You could lose your building, and there were lots of legal things that those 5 years gave a certain kind of peaceable separation. And to my knowledge, most of the classes were on board with that, at least in that era. In former eras, they were a little bit more strict about trying to leave. But given the large exodus and division, that's kind of what it became. And now, of course, the RCA is, the exodus has happened. There's a few straggling churches that haven't left, but there's a lot, now it's becoming sort of this landing pad for the more left-leaning folks that have come out of the CRC and other denominations, right? And so that's likely their church order and things will change to mirror that. Anyway, so that was my experience. And then it was back to the CRC, and I had been highly informed of what was going on and the biblical positions and everything in the report, and even helped with some website stuff, behind the scenes.
Mm-hmm.
But definitely to come back to the CRC and say, okay, I'm kind of home now, right? I had been a member of Trinity CRC, and they kind of oversaw my pastoral ministry, my membership and ordination at the CRC level, and they helped me with the RCA, but also right to say, okay, now we're fully in the CRC, and I met that with much excitement, right? To come back to full-time employment there was good. So that's kind of where we're at now.
That's all we have for this week. If you want to help us out and support the Messy Reformation, another thing you can do is sign up for our newsletter through Substack. That way you'll get episodes and summaries sent directly into your email inbox. It also gives us the ability to communicate with our audience, which is one of the biggest struggles of a podcast. So head over to the Messy Reformation on Substack and sign up for our newsletter. But until then, don't forget this is Christ's church, and he bought it with his blood. And we've been warned that wolves will come in trying to destroy the flock. So keep a close watch on your life and on your doctrine. Preach the word in season and out of season, and keep fighting the good fight in this messy Reformation.